Hearing lies in your head is not your fault. However, it is your responsibility to decide on if you are going to give it life by meditating on it, or if you are going to take it captive and negate it with God's truth. Hi besties, welcome back, and if you're new here, even better. My name is Tiana and I'm here to show you a different side of God. Be sure to stay to the end because I will be showing you an activity that will help you defeat those lies of the enemy and stand firm on what God says. The only way to recognize a lie is to know the truth backwards and forwards. Although there are several ways in finding this out, I'm going to give you two different ways that will help you find out whether or not it's truth or a lie. Number one, ask yourself who is speaking. In John chapter 10, Jesus was speaking about his sheep and how his sheep knows his voice. Specifically in John 10:5, Jesus says, they will never follow a stranger's voice, but will run away from him because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. If the lies in your head are more familiar than what God says about you, you are going to listen to those lies. Lies that say you're ugly, you're not qualified for that, you'll never be good enough for this. You are the daughter or the son of the Most High. What do you mean you're not qualified for that? You were made in God's image. What do you mean you're ugly? If God be for you, who can be against you? Certainly not that job you didn't get. So what do you mean you'll never be good enough? You have to be so rooted in Jesus Christ that you recognize his voice over the stranger's voice. Because whatever you are most familiar with is what you will hold on to. And whatever you are holding on to is what you will follow. Number two, ask yourself, does this thought match what God says in his word? Or does this thought go against what God says in his word? Now, trying to answer that question will be really difficult if you don't know what God says about you. No, not just going to church. No, not just praying. No, not just going to Bible study. The best way you can find out what God says about you is reading what he says about you in his word and being in his presence on a day-to-day basis. When Adam and Eve was in the garden, we see two things. Number one, Eve fell for the enemy's trap. The enemy asked Eve, did God really say you must not eat fruit from any tree in the garden? That was a setup. How? Because the enemy knew that's not what God said. God was very specific on the trees that they could not eat fruit from. The enemy wanted to set Eve up for a conversation. When the enemy is trying to feed us lies and have us second guessing on what God said, a lot of times those don't need a response. Number two, Eve didn't really know what God said. The enemy knows everything that's in that word. He knows everything that God says about you. He is hoping that you don't know. Why? Because if you don't know, he can easily question you on what God says, which in turn will have you questioning what God says. And that's exactly what he did to Eve in the garden. Eve did not know exactly what God said. As soon as the enemy got Eve's attention, Eve said, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will surely die. That's not what God said. So not only did Eve fall in the trap of the enemy from even giving him a conversation, but she let the enemy know that she actually did not know what God said. Had she known God's truth, she would have been able to spot the enemy's lies. When you know God's truth, you will be able to see if that thought in your head matches to what God says or goes against what God says. And the only way to know God's truth is to be in God's truth, which is being in His Word and being in His presence. After you do the first way of recognizing a lie or the second way of recognizing the lie, this is the next step you have to do. Mute the lies. The whisperer, meaning the enemy, is not going to stop whispering lies in your ear. In the book of James, it tells us to resist the devil and he must flee. But before that part, it says, submit yourself to God. But how do we make our minds submit to God? You take those thoughts captive because you have the authority to do so, and that is how you submit your mind to God. Invite the truth. This means exactly what it says. You have to make room for God's truth. This means you have to knock those lies out. Sometimes if a random thought pops up in my head that I know doesn't align with God, I say out loud, no. And that for me is knocking that lie out of here. And then after I say no, I combat it with what God says in regards to that thought that I just had. By doing this, it cancels out the lie and replaces it with God's truth. Notice the pattern. It's a pattern for me to hear lies about my body or becoming a criminal defense attorney. So I'm already prepared to cast those thoughts down because that's a long time pattern for me. However, sometimes it's not always that easy. There are times where I allow myself to get so deep in that thought, in that lie, that it's kind of difficult for me to remember what God actually says about that lie. In times like that, though, the Holy Spirit is always there to remind me, hey, snap out of it. What did God say about you? What did God promise you? What does God's word say about this, about you, about your future? Didn't God say He has the plans for you? Didn't God say He would sustain you? Didn't God say He is always with you and you are never alone? Didn't God say that it will always work for your good? Didn't God say if He is for you, nothing can be against you? Didn't God say you will overcome this just like you will overcome that? The Holy Spirit is always right there to remind us what God said. Decide what to think. Take those thoughts, hold them up to what God says about you, and then decide whether to keep it or trash it. It may not be an easy decision at first, especially when your surroundings are not the best. It is up to you to decide on whether or not you want to believe the lie or stand firm on God's truth. If this shows you a different side of God, be sure to like and subscribe to my video. I want to thank you in advance, and as always, God bless. Bye, bestie.